What's going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against his new rival, Hans Niemann, in a totally insane game taken from their grudge match at the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. 1e4 best by test, and Hans Niemann goes 1c5 to Sicilian defense. Now we have knight to f3 and d6 on the board for Hans. Hans Niemann likely heading for a Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense if Magnus does go d4 with the open Sicilian. However, instead of that, in this game, Magnus does go bishop e5, and this is the Moscow variation of the Sicilian defense. And the idea here is very simple. You develop the bishop, put the king under pressure, and you do set up short castles on the king side on the next move. Now here, Hans Niemann, he can go bishop d7, blocking the check with the bishop, but instead he goes for the more combative idea, knight d7, blocking the check with the knight. Now the idea is you do want to go a6 on the next move, driving back that bishop with a gain of tempo. However, unfortunately, your knight on d7 is a little bit misplaced, and that will give white chances to fight for an opening advantage. Now here, the main move for white is short castles. However, in this game, Magnus plays c3, a very interesting idea. Now the drawback of this move is if Hans Niemann goes knight to f6, putting pressure on that pawn on e4, and that is what Hans does in the game. Normally, if you castle on move 4, then you can go rook to e1, defending the pawn on e4 with the rook, and that would be a perfect placement for the rook. However, that is not possible here, and here Magnus Carlsen shows his idea. He goes queen to e2, defending the pawn with the queen, and he may want to follow up castle and then rook d1, putting the rook on the d file and the queen on the e file. So overall, a very common but still slightly offbeat setup by Magnus Carlsen in this game. Alright, here Hans Niemann, he goes a6, the main idea of this knight d7 variation of the Moscow Sicilian. Alright, now where is the bishop going to go? Well, if you go to d3, it turns out that is a bit of a mistake. Then black can go g6, and he is doing just fine. Instead, bishop a4 is the idea, and here the idea is if Hans Niemann does go b5, as he did in the game, then the bishop can go back to c2 in one tempo, and the bishop will be placed very well on the c2 square. Now here in this position, Hans Niemann has a wide variety of moves he could play. For example, e6, e5, and g6, simply giving that dark square bishop on f8 a place to go to. Those moves are all very playable. However, instead here, Hans Niemann, he actually goes for counterplay on the queen side immediately with the move b5. So, b5 on the board, driving back that bishop, and where should the bishop go to? Well, it turns out c2 is the best square for the bishop. Instead, if you go to b3, then Hans Niemann will be able to go c4 with a gain of tempo on the bishop, and that is a move you want to play in this structure as black. Therefore, bishop c2 is the only logical move. Again, if you go b3, you will lose tempo at some point after Hans goes c4, once again, driving back that bishop to the c2 square. Now here, Hans Niemann, he just continues. Bishop b7 on the board, the best square for the bishop, and now here Hans does have very good pressure on that pawn on e4 of Magnus Carlsen. Of course, it is defended for now, but there is some very uncomfortable pressure there. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he castles on the king side, d4 immediately, may have been a little more precise, but overall, short castle is a very good move for Magnus. Now we have e6, Hans Niemann showing his intentions. He's not going for a dragon setup with g6 or a Najdorf setup with e5. Instead, he's heading for more of a Scheveningen style pawn structure in the center with pawns on d6 and e6, and then followed by bishop e7, developing the bishop, and then short castles. Alright, now Magnus Carlsen, d4, breaking in the center, and now Hans Niemann, he has to find the right move in this position. And it turns out the best idea is bishop e7, setting up short castles on the king side. However, instead of that, here, he actually goes queen c7, and this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake, but only if Magnus Carlsen follows up perfectly. Now, if you like puzzles, go and pause the video right now and try to find the best follow-up for Magnus Carlsen in this position. It's not necessarily a tactical shot, but there is a very good move here for Magnus to fight for the opening advantage. Alright, I hope you found it. The key idea here for Magnus is going to be a4, expanding on the queen side and putting pressure on that pawn on b5, and that is the key of this idea. That pawn on b5 is very hard to defend. It would be attacked by the queen, and you can always follow up bishop d3 at some point in the future, putting more pressure on it. However, Magnus Carlsen didn't find that move here. Instead, bishop d3 on the board is the move for Magnus, and the idea being he's potentially trying to force out the weakening move c4 from Hans Niemann. That would be a very interesting development. Now, the idea being if you get c4 in before Magnus goes d4, then you can recapture en passant whenever Magnus does go d4. However, with those pawns on d4 and e4 already, that c4 advance would release the tension in the center, and it would be good for Magnus Carlsen. So Magnus here, playing with his food, playing with Hans Niemann, just trying to provoke out that move c4 from Hans. But Hans Niemann, he does not oblige. He just goes bishop e7, correcting his mistake on the prior move, where he went queen c7 before bishop e7, and now Hans is doing perfectly fine in this position. Now Magnus, knight d2 on the board, the standard Roy Lopez square for the knight, and now Hans does go rook c8, developing the queen side before castling. Now castling may have been a little bit stronger, but rook c8, a very thematic idea for this structure. Now Now here in this position, Magnus Carlsen does have a choice. He can go, say, rook e1 or rook d1, and then knight f1 to knight to g3, the typical Roy Lopez maneuvering move for the knight. However, instead, he does go for play on the queen side immediately with the move a4, threatening a takes b5, and then winning the pawn on b5. So here, Hans Niemann, he has to do something about it right now. So, what is the best move for Hans? Well, it turns out there are a few different things you can do. For example, you can take on a4, b takes a4. However, that would be a weakening move. It would weaken the pawns on the queen side. Instead, you could also take on d4 immediately and then decide what to do. Instead, here, Hans Niemann, he finally does go c4, expanding on the queen side. This is a decent move. It does relieve the tension on that pawn on b5. However, it also releases the tension in the center, and that is good for Magnus. All right, now, bishop c2 on the board. Very interesting path for the bishop. Bishop b5, then a4, then c2, then d3, and then back to the c2 square. Bishop c2. All right, now, Hans Niemann, his best bet is going to be short castling and then slow playing the game from there. For example, short castles, g6, rook e8, bishop f8, and so on. Instead here, he does see counterplay in the center, and he does break with the move e5. And now here, after this move from Hans Niemann, we do have a pawn structure on the board that is typically reached via the Roy Lopez opening. So very interesting how we start with the Sicilian defense and then reach the Roy Lopez. All right, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing here? Well, it turns out the strongest idea is going to be taking on b5 and then going b3. That is the top computer engine choice. However, instead, he maintains the tension and just goes rook d1. The idea being he can follow up knight f1 and then knight g3. He can also do that move a takes b5 and b3 in the future if he so chooses. Now here, Hans Niemann, he castles, the standard idea for black here, and Magnus does go knight to f1. Now here, Hans Niemann, rook f to e8, a typical maneuver in the Roy Lopez, the idea being you want to go bishop f8, and then if the e-file does open up, the rook will be perfectly placed, and the bishop on f8 also helps with the defense of the king side. And yes, Chess YouTube, I do know this is not a Roy Lopez, but the pawn structure is basically a Roy Lopez opening at this point. All right, now here, Magnus Carlsen, once again, he has the option of taking on b5 and then going b3. However, instead of that, and instead of knight to g3, he does take the moment to close the center of the board with the move d5. Now, this is a very thematic idea in the Roy Lopez, for example, the Chigorin, the Zaitsev, the Breyer variation, and many others. Now, this is a double-edged move. On the one hand, you do gain space in the center, and you do lock in that pawn structure with those pawns on d5, e4, d6, and e5. However, here, Hans Niemann, he will be able to get counterplay on the queen side, particularly against that weak pawn on the a4 square. So here, Hans Niemann, he actually jumps in with the knight to c5, and now the threat is b takes a4 or knight takes a4. And if he gets that move in, no, he won't win a pawn, but he will win the bishop pair after bishop takes and then knight takes. Bishop takes, knight takes. I can't draw arrows. Bishop takes, then knight takes, and that will be to Hans Niemann's benefit here. All right, Magnus Carlsen, what is he going to do about it? Well, it turns out he ignores the threat, and he just goes h3, a perfectly fine move. It's actually the top engine choice. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he may be intending knight g3, knight f5, and so on, playing on the king side. He's just giving Hans Niemann the chance to take on a4. He thinks that is actually better for him than it is for Hans. And here, Hans Niemann, it turns out his best idea is again slow playing, perhaps g6, bishop f8, rook to a8, and so on. But instead, he does take the bait. He takes that pawn on a4 with the b pawn. B takes a4 on the board, and it turns out this is a very significant mistake. As you can see, the eval bar on the left now shooting up to around 1.3 for Magnus Carlsen. That means he has a big advantage in this position according to the engine. All right, now Magnus. Bishop takes a4 on the board, winning back the pawn right away. That is the strongest idea. Now we have knight takes and then rook takes a4 on the board as well. Now the pawn structure has transformed, and here Magnus, he has very good pressure on that pawn on c4. For example, knight to e3 and then rook takes c4 could be a threat in the future. Now here, Hans, what is he going to do about it? Well, he starts by getting space on the queen side with the move a5. Now, if he needs to, he can go bishop a6 in the future, defending the pawn on c4 with the bishop. So, for example, knight to e3 will be met by bishop a6, and Hans Niemann will defend the pawn on c4, and he will be able to defend that pawn for now. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds a way to increase the pressure. Bishop g5 on the board, putting pressure on that knight on f6, and bishop takes f6, believe it or not, could be a threat here. The idea being you take the knight, then you go knight g3 and knight to f5, and that knight will be an uncontested monster on the f5 square, and Magnus may be able to start an attack on the king side. All right, Hans Niemann, he's having none of it. He goes knight d7, retreating the knight and opening up the attack on the bishop on g5. Now, will Magnus Carlsen trade bishops? Well, it turns out bishop takes e7 is the strongest engine move here. That would be very good for Magnus Carlsen, simply getting off black's very important defensive piece, that being the dark square bishop on e7. However, instead here, he actually goes bishop e3, and this turns out to be a slightly weak move. Here, Hans Niemann, he finds a very good way to make use of the placement of the knight on d7 instead of the f6 square. Here, the f-pawn is not restricted, and Hans Niemann just goes f5 in one go, bang, f5 on the board. Now, what is the idea behind this move? Are you giving up a pawn on f5 for free? Well, it turns out this is a temporary pawn sacrifice. Here, Magnus Carlsen is virtually forced to go e takes f5. If you don't, then f4 could be a very dangerous move, and Hans Niemann could set up some sort of King's Indian style attack on the king side with f4, then g5, h5, and g4. So, e takes f5 virtually forced here, and yes, Magnus does win the pawn on f5, but in the process, he removed the defender of the pawn on d5. And here, Hans Niemann, he jumps in with the knight to f6, knight to f6 on the board, and now it's almost impossible for Magnus to defend the pawn on d5, meaning Hans Niemann will win that pawn back on the d5 square and have a great game. Alright, here, Magnus, what should he be doing here? Well, the strongest idea is rook d to a1, immediately putting more pressure on that pawn on a5 as soon as you can. Instead, he does go knight g3, and this turns out to be a slightly dubious idea. The knight simply isn't doing anything on g3 immediately. It was more important to go rook d to a1, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on the queen side. Now here, Hans Niemann, he continues with his plan. Knight takes d5 on the board, and that knight is not hanging. It is defended by the bishop on b7, therefore rook takes d5 is not a possibility here. Alright, Magnus Carlsen, he continues rook d to a1. The best idea, again, increasing the pressure on that weak pawn on a5. How is Hans Niemann going to defend? Well, in the game, he just goes bishop to f8, and it turns out this is a mistake. Instead, knight takes e3 was the move, immediately knocking off black or white's very strong bishop on the e3 square. Instead, bishop f8 on the board, and now Magnus, he just takes that pawn on a5. Rook takes a5, and now that rook is very active on the a file. He's threatening rook to a7 ideas, rook takes d5 ideas in the future, and Hans Niemann is under a lot of pressure here. Alright, in the game, knight to f4 for Hans Niemann, putting pressure on the queen on the e2 square, and now bishop takes f4 is not a good idea. If you go bishop takes, then the response obviously is e takes f4, and you have a double attack on the queen on e2 by the rook and the knight on g3 by the pawn. So, bishop takes f4 would lose on the spot, therefore you do have to move the queen here. So, in the game, Magnus Carlsen, queen d1, the best square for the queen. And now Hans, he jumps in with the knight, knight to d3. He does not want to allow bishop takes f4, as that would now be a good idea for Magnus. Alright here, Magnus Carlsen, this is a critical position in this game. What should he be doing here? Well, it turns out he's a wide variety of very good attacking ideas. For example, rook a7, putting pressure on that bishop on b7, very good. Also, the insane idea, f6, that is actually the top engine idea here. The idea being you go f6, try to blow open black's king side, and then after g takes, you can follow up knight to h5, putting pressure on that pawn. That would be very, very dangerous for black. Instead here, Magnus, he plays the very simple idea, knight g5, a very thematic move for this kind of pawn structure. Now the threat is knight to e6, jumping in with the knight, and that knight will be an absolute monster on e6. And in case you're curious, the nickname for a knight on e6 is the octopus. The octopus with those arms branching out all over into the black position. Alright, now Hans Niemann, what should he be doing? Well, he finds the best idea immediately. Queen c6, putting pressure on that pawn on g2, and the audacity of Hans Niemann threatening checkmate in one move. And here, what is Magnus Carlsen going to do to stop this threat? Alright, Chess YouTube, it's a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus Carlsen. And here's my hint. You do have to look 2 to 3 to 4 moves ahead, as this is a very difficult position. And while you're at it, go ahead and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. Alright, here, Magnus Carlsen, he has a few different ideas to defend. One idea is queen to f1, defending the g2 point with the queen. However, that is a little bit passive. Instead here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds the right idea. Knight 3 to e4, blocking the attack of the queen with the knight on the e4 square. However, this is a very, very double-edged move. Here, Hans Niemann, he immediately finds the right follow-up, h6, putting pressure on that knight on g5. If you go back, say, knight g3, or even knight to e6, then queen takes e4 is the move, as that knight on e4 will be hanging. So with that in mind here, Magnus Carlsen, what the heck should he be doing to deal with this threat? Obviously, the knight on g5 cannot move. It has to be something else. Well, I hope you found the right follow-up earlier. If you didn't, pause the video right now and again try to find the key idea for Magnus Carlsen here in this position. Alright, it turns out there are at least 2 good ideas for Magnus. The first one, the brilliant idea, is actually rook to a6. Now this move looks insane, however there is an idea here. The idea being you're trying to deflect that bishop off the b7 square, off this diagonal. If bishop takes b7, then the follow-up will be queen to h5, and you are threatening ideas like queen to f7, queen g6, and so on. And trust me, that works out in Magnus Carlsen's favor. Here's the idea. Rook a6, bishop takes, queen to h5, and then if h takes, you follow up knight takes g5, and again, the threats include queen to h7, and that would be checkmate. That is a very, very dangerous line for Hans Niemann. Beyond that, you could also go queen to h5 immediately with very similar ideas. Instead, here, Magnus Carlsen, he actually goes queen to g4, and this turns out to be a very critical mistake. As you can see, the eval bar on the left just collapsing in this position. And here, Hans Niemann, he finds the right follow-up. You start by just taking the knight on g5. H takes g5, and now knight takes g5 for Magnus, and now the idea of queen g4, after knight takes g5, the queen does defend g2, so he is okay for now. But here, Hans Niemann, bishop e7, putting pressure on that knight on g5. If that knight falls, it's going to be almost impossible for Magnus to threaten checkmate against the black king. So with that in mind, here, knight to e6 is virtually the only move. You have to keep that knight alive, and now you do have the octopus knight on e6. But now Hans Niemann, he stays cool, calm, and collected. Bishop f6 on the board, defending against the threat of queen takes g7. So both sides threatening checkmate in one move. In this position, this game is getting crazy. All right, here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, what is the right follow-up? Well, there are a few decent moves. For example, rook a7 is very good, putting pressure on that bishop and putting x-ray pressure on the 7th rank. Beyond that, f3 is also good, defending against this diagonal here. And yes, f3 is a weakening move, but it is just that important to stop the threat of queen takes g2 in the future. Instead of that here, Magnus Carlsen, bishop g5 is the move, trying to trade off that bishop on f6. Now, of course, the threat is bishop takes f6. That pawn on g7 is pinned to the king. Therefore, g takes f6 would not be a legal move. So Hans Niemann, what is he going to do about it? Well, it turns out he has a brilliant idea here. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find a beautiful idea for Hans Niemann in this position. All right, hope you found it. The key idea for Hans, believe it or not, is rook takes e6, giving up the rook for the knight. And while the proper name for this move would be an exchange sacrifice, I am going to call it a rook sacrifice, as I know how much you guys love to comment on that in the comment section. So, rook takes e6, the rook sacrifice, the brilliant idea. And here's how it works. Rook takes, then f takes, then bishop takes, then queen takes, and then rook to e8. So Hans Niemann giving up the rook or the exchange just to slow down the attack. He will win that pawn on e6, and Magnus Carlsen's attack on the king side would be virtually over. And again, Hans Niemann here, he is up a piece. He has those 3 minor pieces versus the 2 of Magnus Carlsen. Therefore, giving up the rook for the knight with the rook sacrifice would work out in his favor. Instead of that, though, here, Hans Niemann, he doesn't find rook takes e6. Instead, bishop takes g5 is the move for Hans, and now queen takes g5 for Magnus Carlsen, and here Magnus, once again, he is threatening checkmate in one move on g7. And by the way, if you're curious, knight takes g5 was the slightly better move in that position instead of queen takes, but instead, queen takes on the board. Now here, Hans Niemann, once again, he has the option of playing the rook sacrifice, rook takes e6, giving up the rook for the knight, and again, the idea being rook takes, f takes, then rook to e8, putting pressure on that pawn on e6. Hans Niemann would likely win back that extra pawn, and the threat against g7 would be over once and for all. But instead here, Hans Niemann, rook to e7, defending with the rook instead of sacrificing it for the knight, and now Magnus Carlsen in this position. He finds an absolutely stunning idea to increase the pressure. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the stunning move for Magnus Carlsen. And here's my one hint. We saw this move before in a sub-variation. That's all you're getting out of me. All right, here, the key idea for Magnus and the one he finds in the game. Rook to a6. An absolutely brilliant idea. The idea being you want to deflect away the bishop on b7 from this diagonal. And once the bishop moves, you can take the rook on e7. So currently, that rook is technically hanging. However, if you take it right away, then queen takes g2 is checkmate on the spot. So again, rook to a6, deflecting the bishop, then you take on e7, and then your threats on g7 are just overwhelming. So here, Hans Niemann, he does not take on a6. That would be suicide. Instead, queen d7 on the board, increasing the pressure on that pawn on g7, but temporarily giving up those checkmating threats on g2. And that is exactly what Magnus Carlsen wants. Now here, Magnus, he continues. Rook b6, putting more pressure on that bishop and threatening rook to a7. That bishop would be pinned, and rook takes b7 would be a very, very real threat. Now here, Hans Niemann, he has to get that bishop out of the line of fire. He has to do it right now. But the key question is, where do you put the bishop? Well, in the game, Hans Niemann did go bishop c6, but it turns out that is a very big mistake. Here, you have to go bishop d5, simply getting the bishop out of the attack of the rook on b6. Instead, bishop c6 on the board, and here's the problem with this move. In this position, Magnus Carlsen, once again, has yet another tactical shot. And again, if you like puzzles, pause the video once again and try to find this tactical shot for Magnus Carlsen. All right, the key idea here is the rook sacrifice. Rook takes c6, giving up the rook for the bishop or the exchange, whatever you want to call it. Here's the idea. Rook takes c6, and then if you take back with the queen, then queen takes e7, wins the rook on e7. You are up the bishop. That would be devastating. So instead, if you go rook takes c6 back, rook takes, then the key idea is rook to a8 check, then rook c8, then rook takes, queen takes, and once again, queen takes e7 does win back the rook. You would be up the piece. You're winning the bishop on c6. So rook takes c6 here would be devastating, but Magnus, he does not find it. Instead, rook a to a6 is played in the game, and now here Hans Niemann, he has a chance to defend with the move rook to e8, getting the rook out of the line of fire of the queen. Instead here, knight to f4 on the board for Hans Niemann, and this turns out to be a mistake. And here, Magnus Carlsen, he finally does take on c6 with the rook. Rook takes c6 on the board. Hans Niemann takes back. Rook takes c6 back. And here, Magnus Carlsen, the key idea, once again, rook to a8 check, then rook c8, then rook takes, queen takes, and finally queen takes e7. However, here, Magnus, he misses the idea. He just takes on c6. Rook takes c6 on the board. And now Hans Niemann, he has one last tactical shot that he could play to get a decisive advantage in this game. And again, if you like puzzles, pause the video once again and try to find this tactical shot for Hans Niemann as black. All right, the idea here, as usual, you're going to capture the knight with the rook. Rook takes e6, and this one is not a rook sacrifice. You literally just win the knight on e6 for free. And then after the rook moves, say rook takes c4, then you can follow up rook f6, and you are defending everything, and you will be up the extra knight. However, Hans Niemann, he was not on his A game here. He missed the idea. Instead, he goes knight takes e6, and this is a fatal mistake. Here, Magnus, f takes e6, wins back the knight, then queen takes e6, and finally rook takes c4. The idea being, if you take the rook with the queen, then your rook on e7 falls to the other queen, and that is what happens in the game. So queen takes c4, queen takes e7 on the board, and now finally we have a queen and pawn endgame, where Magnus Carlsen has those 5 pawns versus just the 3 of Hans Niemann. I may not be good at math, but I know 5 is more than 3, and that does give Magnus Carlsen a big advantage in this endgame. But can he seal the deal? Can he win the endgame with just the queens and the pawns and the kings on the board? Let's find out. Queen d5 on the board for Hans, threatening queen d1 check, ideas like that. But now Magnus, queen to e8, hits the king h7, then queen to h5, hits the king once again, king g8, and then queen to e2. Here Magnus is defending both the pawn on b2 and that d1 square. There are no checks in this position for Hans. Now here, Hans Niemann, e4 on the board, trying to get some sort of counterplay, but Magnus Carlsen, he's having none of it. b4, expanding on the queen side. His passed b-pawn being his biggest asset in this position, and now the threat is b5, again, continuing to march that pawn down the board. All right, queen e5 on the board for Hans, but then queen c4 is the king. d5, queen d4, offering the trade of queens. If those queens come off the board, that pawn will march down to b8. That will be game over effectively immediately. Instead, queen to e6 on the board for Hans Niemann, but now b5 for Magnus. And in this position, Hans Niemann, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen, as there is simply no way to stop that pawn from pushing down the board. He's had enough. He is done in this game. Wow, what a game by Magnus and Hans Niemann at the 2024 Speed Chess Championships. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button.